Distinguished guests and fellow colleagues, welcome to today's CRC lecture series. My name is Sharon and I'm from the Centre for Livable Cities. The Centre was jointly established by the Ministry of National Development and the Ministry of Environment and Water Resources in 2008 to distill, create and share knowledge on livable and sustainable cities. The CRC lecture series is one of the platforms through which urban thought leaders share best practices and exchange ideas and experiences. Today's lecture is jointly organized by the CRC and the MPA Academy, which is the training arm of Maritime and Port Authority Singapore. In today's session, we are honored to have with us Dr. Martin Stopford, President of Clarkson Research Services Limited. The lecture will examine the big trends driving the shipping industry today and their implication on port cities. The format for today's lecture will start off with a presentation by Dr. Stopford. This will be followed by a closed panel discussion and a Q&A session with the audience, which will be moderated by Mr. Andrew Tan, Chief Executive of MPA. With this, let us start the session by inviting Dr. Stopford on stage. Dr. Stopford, please.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real privilege and honour to be with you. Such a lovely audience this afternoon. I've been quite a challenging topic, global trends in shipping and the impact on port cities. And I must say I've found the process of developing a few thoughts on this topic very interesting. It's always good when you get a chance to focus on something that leads you forward to some conclusions. And so I think I can say that although I've been following the maritime industry for many years, this particular talk has led me to some ideas that I hadn't really contemplated before. And I hope these will add some value. I know from the many years of visiting Singapore the enormous amount of research that the MPA and other institutions put into port cities, and I don't for a minute pretend that I'm going to give you anything new on your shopping list, but what I hope I can do this morning is to help to provide some perspective about where we're going in the distant future. And in the distant future is not very distant in shipping terms. 30 years is only the life of a merchant ship, and really in almost any business, I find 10 years, it takes 10 years to do almost anything. So it is important to think about the future. It is important to take big decisions. And it's very difficult sometimes for the decision makers to have confidence on where the main theme should be taking them. That perhaps is the hardest thing. And that is what I want to do this afternoon, is to look at these very big issues. What I'm going to do is start by a potted history of 5,000 years of shipping. I apologize if that seems a lot to cram into about 4 or 5 minutes, but well, you know, you shouldn't take too long over these things. And then when I've done, and I've got some specific conclusions from that, and then I want to move on to the real focus, because in any business you have to get down to the basics, and the basics are what you're there for, and what we're here for is not asset play, it's not to become billionaires, we're there to provide cheaper, better sea transport. Ultimately, that's what pays our living and what we have to plan to do better in future. And one of my themes is going to be, we're at a point where the things we've done in the past perhaps won't work so well in the future as they have in the past, so we have to look at a change of direction, really. That's the point. Now, as far as these themes are concerned, I've got 4 big trends that I want to talk to you about. I mean, the nice thing about these big trends, you don't have to go into too much detail, because I think the detail has to be worked out. The strategy is a high-level thing, and it's counterproductive to be too prescriptive about how you implement a strategy. But the strategy is about where you want to go. And I've got 4 big themes that are going to drive this. And the first one is globalization. It's a beautifully ambiguous term, but in my sort of perception of the techno-economic development of shipping, globalization falls into a series of parts which I'll talk to you about. And then I'll move on to fossil fuels, because really the transport industry we know today and love today is there because of fossil fuels, and fossil fuels have two serious problems at the moment which we need to get to grips with and really haven't quite done yet. The third one is mechanisation, I might add, of cargo handling, because most of the strategy of shipping companies in the last, and ports in the last 50 years, has been almost exclusively devoted to the mechanisation of shipping. And I'll develop that theme just a little bit more. And my argument is that mechanisation is sort of running out of steam. We've picked the low-hanging fruit, we've squeezed the technology as hard as we can. It's hard to get good results from the same old formula. We have to find something else. And the something else I am focusing on is the fourth trend, which is information. That's not new. Information management has been around since they put the first cables under the sea in 1855. But the information that has suddenly come available in the last 10 years is a very different animal from anything we've seen in the previous century. And I want to end up by looking at how that fits in with our vision of the future for shipping. So that's my agenda, and then I'll do a little bit about issues for port cities as far as, or implications for port cities. That's my agenda, and I'll try to stick to time. Well, let me start off with the potted history of shipping. I call it the West Line because it's something I noticed many, many years ago. In fact, my brother, who had the idea of calling it the West Line, he noticed that the shipping industry started up. Sort of the first bit, 5,000 years ago, was in the North Indian Ocean, trade between the Indus and the Mesopotamian civilization in Babylon. That was one of the bigger trades, and shipping at that time was very well developed. We have copies of the Mesopotamian Maritime Code, which had all sorts of practical things, like you had to pay your freight in advance in those days, which I think is something that ship owners today would love. Unfortunately, they mostly get paid freight in arrears, and it's sometimes hard to get it, Then the West Line moved from there onwards. And what I'd like to do is just run very briefly through the track that the focus, the epicentre of shipping's followed over 5,000 years. And I'll just throw in a few comments about the sorts of places that became prominent in shipping. And from this, I hope we can draw some conclusions. It's very high-level conclusions about what matters if you're looking at a maritime city, a port city, if you're trying to understand how the shipping world is going to change next. And we start off in the Arabian Gulf, 3000 BC, and that lasted until about 300 BC, a long time, when the Phoenicians started to trade initially in the Eastern Mediterranean, and then in the whole of the Mediterranean. And in fact, they were based in Tyre, a small island not unlike Singapore, in fact, an island on the east coast of the Mediterranean. From the Phoenicians, we move up to Athens and Corinth, who traded across the Mediterranean to Alexandria and other towns of the East Med, and there was a sophisticated trading network those time. At that time, Athens didn't really have many resources. They had a bit of olive oil and some silver, and really they went to sea and got involved with shipping because it was important to them. It was a way they could make a living, and they became maritime people with the many islands that they have. Then we moved to Rome. Rome was a cargo centre. Rome was not like Athens or the Phoenicians. Rome didn't make its living out of shipping. Rome had an enormous urban population. It had to feed by bringing in grain from North Africa. And so Rome became a great shipping centre because it had cargo. But the next shipping centre after that was Venice and perhaps Genoa. Venice is up at the north of the Adriatic. It was almost an island. It was actually a water area on the crossroads between the eastern trade, which came overland from Asia, and the trade route down the Rhine to northwest Europe, which at that time was becoming a major trading centre facing onto the North Atlantic. And a little bit after Venice, incidentally, Venice did very well out as a subcontractor to the Byzantine Empire, who wasn't very interested in shipping, and so they were happy to do a deal with the Venetians to carry their trade. Hanseatic League, well, these were the ports which sat on the Baltic and the North Sea and controlled the trade between the west coast of Europe and the Baltic, which was the other big trade you got at the time. And they grew in power, and many of them are still shipping centres today. The big focus of shipping came in 1650, or actually it's a bit before that. It was the end of the 16th century, beginning of the 16th century, and the Dutch miracle. Dutch was a sort of, Holland was a mud patch around the estuary of the Rhine, and they succeeded in turning this into a very successful commercial centre with an enormous fleet of ships trading out. They did shipbuilding. They took away the shipbuilding from Venice. It was, and indeed, one of the great problems for the Venetians was when the ships started to go round and sail direct to northwest Europe through the Gibraltar Straits instead of the trade going by land. That was the beginning of the time of Venice. England, of course, pushed the Dutch out when the Industrial Revolution started in the 18th century. And so, as we move to this point in about the beginning of the 19th century, we start to have a strong maritime centre around the North Atlantic. And that was reinforced as the North American economy grew, and we started to have big economies on both sides of the Atlantic, and the North Atlantic became the world's dominant trading zone. That lasted until the 1950s, when Europe and Japan were rebuilding their economies after the war, and Japan became the next miracle economy and the next centre of maritime trade, building up an enormous volume of cargo. And I think the Japanese, who became and still are today the world's biggest ship owners in terms of beneficial ownership, they have the biggest tonnage of ships, even more than the Greeks. But Japan is predominantly, like the Romans, like Britain, a cargo-based society. They built their maritime around cargo. And so, to a great extent, did South Korea, which followed and developed very rapidly as a maritime centre in the 80s, and then China, another very big cargo centre which really started to develop from about the mid-1990s, when the various financial deregulation and the change of various laws that allowed them to trade and allowed companies to come in and develop within China. So we now find today that the shipping world as we know it at the moment consists of three centres. The old European centre, which blended with the North American centre to form the North Atlantic trading bloc, and the Asian bloc, which has developed very rapidly over the last 50 years. And I think when we look at this west line, it has now pretty well circumnavigated the world. We're back where we started. We say, well, where do we go next? And I think the answer to that is that the world is ready to take a step to shipping, to a global shipping world. At the moment, we consist of a world which is really, if you take the container trade, it works along the middle latitudes, the famous east-west trades, and then they throw in the north-south trades as extras. I think that's a phase in our development, and if you are to look forward to what vision we might see, then the vision for the next 50 years is a global world of trade and a global shipping industry. And of course, you say, what is that? And let's go on and define that a little bit more. If 50 years ago you had sat down and said, just to slightly restate what I'm saying, if you'd put me here in 1950 and said, what is the next big phase for shipping? We had 12,000 ton ships and a lot of cargo handling, and if you correctly had understood what was going on, you would have said that the future was big ships, big hubs, east-west trade. That was where things were going. What I'm suggesting is that if I stand here today and say, in the same sense as 50 years ago, what is today's next phase? I think the next phase is smart ships, smart terminals, and super cities. That's my buzzword. Like all good economists, I'm not defining these too closely, because I think the essence of strategy is that you define goals, and the essence of tactics and implementation is you turn those goals into those strategies into identifiable goals, targets, and measurable results. That's the way you do it. And so the last thing you want is when you're doing the vision you have to satisfy yourself that the vision is the correct vision, and then you can single-mindedly devote yourself to the way in which you're going to articulate that vision and make it happen. And visions don't happen quickly. Well, keeping on with my theme of going back to history, because I think, shipping, things don't change, the people don't change, the ships change, but the people don't change. 200 years ago, the ships looked like this. They were not doing very well. Shipping was getting very expensive, and it's not surprising. I mean, even with this crane, these guys, there's all sorts of people handling one little bundle of cargo. And the problem was you couldn't build the ships any bigger because they were built out of wood, and there was limits really to how big you could build a commercial ship with wooden masts, hemp ropes, and all the other limitations on the size of the ship, not least loading it. And even worse, at that time, people had built so many ships and warships that they were running out of timber in Europe, and they were having to import it, and it was very expensive. So 200 years ago, we were at a crossroads. The shipping hadn't changed much, and it needed to change. And I think if you had taken one of these men sitting in this picture here, if you can see them from where, and you put him, and you confronted him with this, he would say, well, it's astonishing, but it's still a ship. It's 200 years of applying technology and economics to a problem with a magic ingredient. And the magic ingredient is fossil fuels and mechanisation. Those are the two I want to talk about later on. But before I do that, what I want to say, what shipping is not about, the answer is not about asset play. I mean, I hear many ship owners say, oh, we trade ships, not cargo, and your aim is to buy the ship cheap, sell it well, and make a fortune. You can definitely do that. I mean, John Fredrickson, the Norwegian ship owner, has made billions buying and selling things, and he's extremely good at it. And some people can, just like there are some people who can go to the casino or go to a game of poker, and they can consistently make a living by playing poker, or they can do day trading of shares online and they make a living. But that doesn't mean that is what the serious world is about. It means it's something that it's the crumbs that fall off the table. What the serious world of shipping is about is cheaper freight. That is the goal. It's always the same thing, and this is the history. If you could read this properly, it's not a very good chart. I wonder if, yeah, there we go. I'm afraid my lines haven't shown up very well, but what I've done is to take the freight chart in the previous diagram, this one, and I've corrected it for inflation. So this is money at the time, and it's pretty astonishing that the money you were charging for freight in dollars only a few years ago is not much different from the money you were charging in 150 years ago. Not many other industries can say that. So what I've done is to correct this for inflation. And this is the chart. You can't see it, but it wiggles around here. That's the trend. And it's going up for the reasons that I mentioned in my previous comments, that the freight rates went up because the sailing ships were facing increasing costs. So during the 19th century, 18th century, the shipping industry was stuck. It wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't doing its job properly. It needed a revolution. It got the revolution from fossil fuels and cheap coal and bigger ships. That's what it managed to do. And you see that by progressively getting better steam engines, better ships, it moved along this track, and the cost of freight fell steadily between 1830 and 1914. And then we have a bit of an interim between the wars, and we come to the next phase, which was 1945 to 1986, where the freight rate, the real freight rate, continues to fall. And the reason it continues to fall is because of mechanisation. I'm going to go through that a little bit more with you. But basically, in 1945 was a radical change which allowed the industry to introduce a whole new range of technology. And finally, 1987 to 2013, I'm afraid this is a bit unfortunate, my key. That is the trend. It starts to go up again. In the last 20 years, the unit cost of freight has been going up. And let's just focus on this little bit of the part chart. Okay, this bit here. Let's see. Now, this is that bit of the chart, and you can see how the mechanisation between 1947 and 1987 reduced the freight costs by 75% in real terms. That is a very good result for the industry. Then, from 1987 to 2011, it started to go up again. And my argument, which I will put forward in the next few slides, is that during this period, we'd squeezed all the value out of mechanisation technology, and actually we were facing the problem of diminishing returns in terms of physical mechanisation, plus the fossil fuels, which are a very big part of this cost reduction, starting to go up in value. So you had two big problems working simultaneously against the industry. And so that leaves me with the, onto the mega trends which are driving trade, and which I want to focus on as the sort of seeds that are planted today, which will drive the industry during the next 50 years. And the first one is globalization, and I want to focus especially a bit on the 50 years since the Second World War, since 1945. The second one is fossil fuels. You just can't underestimate the impact which fossil fuels have had on shipping, and they have just made so much possible. And the fossil fuels are running into problems which we need to discuss. Mechanisation, I want to talk to you about how it happened, what it involved, and why it's becoming more of a problem today. And finally, information, which I see, it's a bland word we hear so much of, but I see the information in some form as the next step, the place where there is still value to be unlocked in the business. So let me just quickly run through those 4 mega trends. The first one is globalization. In one sense, globalization started in 1498 when we discovered how to sail to Asia from Europe. But really, and it's gone through a series of phases since then, but where we are today, I think today's industry particularly developed in the post-war period, and it was initiated very specifically at a conference held at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods in the United States. It was called by Henry Morgenthau, the American Secretary of State, and his aim very specifically was that after the war, this was when the Allies were winning the war, and his aim was to make sure that after the war we had a dynamic world economy of free trade. Why did he say that? Because before the war, the world wasn't a world of free trade. It was a world dominated by European empires. If Coca-Cola wanted to open a bottling plant in Nigeria, they asked some civil servant and he told them to go away because it was a British colony, you know. So I think the Americans, they used their position to get rid of that, and they did it massively successfully. At that meeting, they set up the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. Within 10 years, the empires had been disbanded, and we moved into a world where multinationals could source their raw materials anywhere they wanted to. They moved their steel mills to the coast. They brought in iron ore from abroad in enormous iron ore carriers with fantastic economies of scale in the system. You got your oil from the Middle Eastern VLCCs. You developed a whole generation of specialized ships. And this really was at the period when the world was free to grow. And this growth, the shipping industry, was really the lubricant, if you like, which helped this enormous expansion of trade to grow. The chart here shows the volume of trade of cargo in billions of tons. This is a regional graph. I don't have such up-to-date data for regional trade, but currently the trade last year reached 10 billion tons from our commodity statistics. So we've gone from 500 million tons to 10 billion tons of trade within this period, where the world was moving to a global free trade system driven by the USA. Now, the point I really want to make at the moment is that when that trade development started in 1950, the world was a very imbalanced place. The Atlantic imports and exports accounted for 85% of the world's cargo, and the Asia-Pacific imports and exports accounted for about 15%. And in 2008, the year of the great financial crisis in the Atlantic, the volume of imports and exports by Asia-Pacific overtook the Atlantic. And those trends are moving upwards. We don't know quite how. I've projected some trends from the history. But at this point in time, the cargo volumes are pretty well balanced between the great oceans of the world. We have a balanced world economy, which we didn't have until quite recently. And that, I think, is one of the building blocks for the conclusions I want to draw. Is today we've moved from a very unbalanced world economy dominated by the North Atlantic to a much more balanced economy where the Atlantic and the Pacific are similar. And possibly we're moving towards a world where there'll be more domination by the Asia-Pacific cargo and less by the North Atlantic. They're mature economies, they're very service-driven. We have a long road to go in the Atlantic. Now, there's a second change going on. The shipping industry is pretty quick on the mark. I've developed an enormous respect for ship owners over the years. They seem to have a sixth sense for figuring out the right thing to do. And one of the things they've done in the last 30 years is to move offshore. The blue bars in this chart show the tonnage of ships registered offshore. That is to say, registered under a flag which isn't the flag of the owner, the beneficial country of the owner. For example, a Greek ship owner, who we all know what a Greek ship owner is, who registers in Liberia or in Singapore or in Hong Kong or in Marshall Islands, that would, in this classification, be counted as a foreign flag. And as of last year, 1 billion tonnes of shipping were registered under a foreign flag. And that means that the nationality, the owners, are detached from the ships, and the ownership companies have a need for a domicile. They need somewhere to go. They are international entities, and they need a place to set up their offices. They need a place where they can meet their peer group. They need a place where they can get the services that they need. You know, that's an implication of this trend, and it's going up at the rate of about 1% a year. So that's my second building block. The third thing is the challenge of trade. I don't know if you can read this, but cargo volume doubled from 5 billion tonnes to 10 billion tonnes in the last 18 years at 4.4%. If we grow cargo trade at 2.25%, it will actually double again in 30 years. So by 2050, we will be looking at somewhere between 20 and 25 billion tonnes of cargo. And this raises quite a few issues. It raises resource issues. It raises the challenge of providing transport for that fleet. The IMO has committed the shipping industry to a 50% reduction in the carbon footprint by 2050. Now, we're talking about a big increase in cargo volume, and that is quite a challenge in itself. There's all the issues of pollution and clean ships that go with that, and there is the problem of whether we can manage to sustain a free world and a free trading system which is ever cheaper and more efficient as we have done in the past. In other words, can the next generation come up with the sort of cost reductions that the last generation of ship owners done? 75%, that's a big, big increase. And this all needs radical thinking. So if you think some of the comments I make in my conclusions are a bit visionary and perhaps a little bit fanciful because we're not going to do that, you really have to accept the fact that sometimes things do change, and and part of moving forward is changing. Let's move on to fossil fuels pretty briefly. They were cheap, plentiful oil was the bedrock of shipping in the last 50 years. But oil, which is our big fuel today, has two problems. The price has trebled, and it could well increase further. The carbon emissions and carbon footprint are a major problem. Those two problems are both there. I find the shipping industry, as I travel around, I think people are looking for a lead on this. I don't think they're very comfortable with how we're going to meet these particular challenges. This chart, which shows the price of oil, just emphasizes the scale of the change that's taken place in terms of our primary fuel. I mean, oil used to be much cheaper. The bunkers for the ship used to cost a lot less in daily cost terms than the ship. Now the bunkers cost a lot more than the ship. This is a true revolution. And in addition, we've been very unsuccessful in predicting the price of oil. This chart just shows you a succession of price forecasts for oil. 10 years ago, the major agencies, the IEA and the EIA, the two great energy forecasting agencies, both thought that the price of oil would be $30 a barrel in 2030. So I think that this is an area where today, of course, they take a very different view. They're talking about prices that could be as high as $200 a barrel by 2035. So I think that, that the whole question of energy price is a very big one, and one which deserves fairly radical action if we can think of radical actions. Now, a lot of the stuff that shipping can do to improve its energy performance is not really radical, it's a bit fiddly. You can do lots of things to fine-tune the existing state-of-the-art technology in the ship. I won't go through those, but it's quite straightforward stuff. Waste heat economizers, newest ducts, and big companies like Maersk, for example. I attended a lecture just before Christmas by Bo Surupsines. He went through in detail how Maersk managed this, and believe me, they have a massive program on this. And the key, the single takeaway from that is you have to quantify your goal, your target savings, and then you make sure you get them, because this is a very difficult area, very difficult indeed to quantify. The second thing is really you need to improve the onboard technical skills and procedures to allow modern technology to be used both on the ship and managed from land, because I think there's a general feeling about that we're very light on the technical side, the engineering. The engine manufacturers tell me that they deliver electronic engines, but they're not convinced that the chief engineers really know how. There's these two computer terminals, they're not quite sure how they work, so they leave them alone, and as long as there's a noise coming out of the engine room, don't touch it, you know. Whoops-a-daisy. That's it. Then the third thing is we can adopt clean fuel, LNG. I know there's a lot of interest in bunkers. I think LNG is going to move in progressively. It fits. It's not rocket science. Works very well within environmentally controlled areas. There's plenty of LNG ships operating, well, quite a few working quite well at the moment. If you can nail down the price, everything's fine. The price is a bit of an issue at the moment. The third thing that you can do is go to the logistics area, and this is the one for the last 20 years, every so often any shipping company sticks logistics on the end of its company name, you know, because it sounds good. My sense is that logistics is not really done in the sense that it could be done. That's the world, we live in a world of loaners. The company isn't, just like the trade areas are not stitched together, the companies are not really stitched together. Getting people to cooperate is such a hard thing to do. It's one of the toughest tricks, you know, getting computer systems that work between industries. This is a nightmare, but tough, you know, it's the tough things that are the good things. What I always look for in my business, well, it's not my business now, but Clarkson Research, you're very happy when something's difficult because you know nobody else is going to be as patient as you are, you know. And then, of course, one of the other areas where you can do an enormous amount to improve the carbon footprint is to establish speed optimization programs. You know, slow steaming, we still look at ships as though they're designed to go fast, and sometimes when they have to, they go slow. This is quite wrong. We should be constantly monitoring every aspect of the performance of the ship. I've got a video called On Any Day, made by Shell in 1972. The 5 oil companies ran their fleets as a single fleet. They coordinated every single aspect. Those tankers, they went into berth on time. They were out in 15 hours. The tanker fleet has never operated so efficiently. You can do it, but you really need cargo owners in the game to do this. It's very hard for the ship owners to do it. In the end, we're just the subcontractors. And then finally, we've got the really advanced fuel-saving technology, sail, nuclear, all these other things that you can, fuel cells, the things that are there in the future and might very well become viable under certain circumstances. But these are the raw material we have to work from. And what the shipping industry needs today is a framework to apply all these different things, to get comfortable with the vision. And then once you've got the vision, you can say, right, that's how these things fit in, along with other things. Mechanisation is my third trend. And again, it's very, you forget, this is what shipping was like, this is 1954. You couldn't do what we do today with this. And the world urgently needed a way to carry trade more efficiently. And the ships were spending half their time in port. Multinational cargo company drove the process really. In the bulk area, the integration of transport systems was run by the cargo owners. In the container area, the revolution was actually run by the famous Mr. McLean, the trucker who set up the first container, Sealand, the first container company. And I think it's fair to say that we were chatting about this earlier, that the liner companies in those days, the Blue Funnel, which was the Maersk of its day, did not want to do it. They were forced into it by financial pressures, by year after year, no money, and they just couldn't make returns. And when year after year a business doesn't make returns, you've got a problem. As an economist, that is a problem. And you look for the solution, and the solution in this case was this ginormous change. You use containers, you abandon all the existing ships, and it took 30 or 40 years, really, to get the containerization going. Started, 56 was the first nominal international container service, 66 was the first proper one, and it was the 90s before it was really big business. And the point about mechanization is that we have run through, we've picked the low-hanging fruit. Whoops-a-daisy, sorry, let me move this round. This chart here shows the saving on the right-hand axis, the bar, is the saving by increasing the size of a 35,000 deadweight bulk carrier by 5,000 deadweight. And to begin with, you increase the size by 5,000 deadweight, you save 12% in unit cost. By the time you get down to 140,000 deadweight, you're only saving about 2%. At 180,000, you're saving 1.5%. Now, 1.5% is good to save, but this is a lot of work, a lot of investment, a lot of loss of flexibility from a port point of view. These bigger ships, they are not saving much money. They're not saving as much money. You save much more money by getting a 30,000-ton cargo into a 40,000-ton ship than you do generally at the bottom of the scale, than you do by going to the big end of the scale. So I think that on the mechanisation front, the problem is we're running out of steam, and you're looking for the next generation. And as I mentioned earlier, the next area of unexploited technology is the information revolution. This has been at the heart of shipping since the 1860s. I mean, Clarksons was set up on the cable system. I mean, Henry Benham, the head broker at Clarksons, used to go down to the Baltic Exchange twice a day. He'd fix the ships, he'd write the fixtures on the cuff of his paper. He had a paper cuff on his shirts, that was what they did in those days. And he would write the fixture on, and he'd run back to the office. He'd cable his owners in Calcutta, in Singapore, wherever it was, and that was how he spent his days. And you could do that because London was at the hub of the information network. It was the place where all the cables went to. Well, today's web cloud computing systems have the ability to generate information, process it, store it, analyze it. All the raw materials are there. It's grown massively in the last couple of years, the platform has the power to unite all these sources of information, onboard sensors, satellite information, the big data, the cloud computing, 4G. There are so many aspects of this revolution. The consumers, you know, Steve Jobs did a fantastic job for the consumer sector. He bullied Apple into producing what everybody wanted. I bet 2/3 of you have got one, right? I'm a BlackBerry man myself, but I'm an economist. But you know, if you didn't have a Steve Jobs, we probably wouldn't have an iPhone. We'd have 1,000 different Nokias. So somebody has to beat heads together and make this work. And I mean, I ran the IT at Clarksons for some years. You know, one of the most useful things we did was just putting all the offices on the cloud. So it made us count. From that, we discovered how many employees we got. We didn't, you know, we didn't know before. I had held the first conference here in Singapore of all our offices, and I think that changed the perception of the business. After you could email anybody in the business with the same email address, and you know, instead of them all having their own ISP with all their own fine little email addresses, which nobody told you what it was, I think that helped Clarksons to change its vision to a global business. And we now are one of our biggest offices, I think easily our biggest office outside London is here in Singapore. And there's no doubt about it that these platforms can unite, they can create vision, they can make the industry work together, they can add value. It's not easy to do. And I think that the shipping, when I go back to the chart I showed you at the beginning, where the big circle comes down, the global shipping centres, I think that the shipping industry needs a global perception. And the question that I was asked to discuss at the beginning of this was the implication for port cities. And I think port cities are the people. I'm not totally happy with port cities as a phrase. I prefer ports and cities. And you know, perhaps we can discuss this later, but I think the jobs of ports and the jobs of cities in shipping are very different. And for clarity of objectives, it's good to at least separate them a little bit. But let me give you a few takeaways for port cities. I mean, it's hard not to be impressed by Steve Jobs. He did, you know, it was a miracle. Having worked in big corporations, to get a company of that size that was non-digital community. I just got a message 5 minutes in a non-digital format, right? You know, there's still some better good roles for paper. I promise I will finish in 5 minutes, okay? You know, Steve, to get a company that's... if only Microsoft, if only Bill Gates could have done the same thing. I hate Windows 8. I find Office 2010 a complete nightmare. And so never underestimate the power of a vision, the power of persistence, the power of the ability to draw things together. That ingredient has to be there. I think that, so the takeaways. Mechanisation strategy is running out of steam, information strategy next. For ports, that's an important decision. I think the Maersk Mc-Kinney model could, look, I've been saying this for years, I think that really even Maersk realises that the whole thing's peaked out now. I think you're at the end of an era, and they've struggled with the triple E's. I think tomorrow's globalisation is about smart ships, smart operations, smart technicians. What does it mean? You really need the Steve Jobs of the industry to interpret it. We don't quite know what we want, but we know where we want to get to. We want to be smarter, save energy, save effort, save time, save paper, save resources in so many different areas. The lesson from the geography, I think the West Line, is that geography is key. if you're in the right place at the right time. And island states tended to do well in shipping historically, I think because they don't have the conflicts, the big cargo areas. People say, well, what about China? Well, of course, China is going to have a lot of ports because they're a big cargo centre. Whether China is that interested in shipping, China has a lot of other eggs to fry. And if you're working in Shanghai, there's a lot of other places you can find a job apart from shipping. And shipping is a business that benefits from enthusiasts. It is, in the end, an offshore business. And I think that's what makes it so good and so adaptable. I think Asia-Pacific's trade is gaining critical mass. So that means that the geographical location in the Asia-Pacific area is something to be exploited and built on. And the offshore shipping registration continues. So owners need shipping super cities. They need places to go. And there's lots of them. They're dabbling around. They're wandering around Monaco, Geneva, London, Hamburg. And they're looking for the place where they can put their businesses. And I think the thing I'd chuck in now as well is that the more you can put the cargo and the beneficial owners together, the better it is. So, concluding comments. I think it's the mega cycles that drive shipping. What I've said is that sea cargo volumes might double again in the next 30 years. It's a massive challenge. It's not a forecast, it's a challenge. There are many factors we've got to take account of. Everyone in business knows that. You just have to plan for the best you can, try to understand the trends and do what your customers will buy. And where you're not sure if your customers have got it right, you because after all, I don't think if you've gone around asking people, do you want an iPhone 5? They'd have said, oh, not sure about that, sounds complicated. Steve Jobs didn't bother to ask them, he just did it because he knew it was what they wanted. You've got diminishing returns in mechanisation. You've got issues which show the issue is how the shipping industry can improve its performance, and I think the more efficient transport, cheaper freight, smaller carbon footprint, zero air and water pollution are all the goals. These are the things we've got to. We won't make money out of them, but we have to do them. All of these, I think, your best shot. I'm not saying mechanisation is dead, but it's hard work. I think that there's a new technology in town. It's knowledge management. It's appeared very recently. You all know about it. You're all carrying it in your pocket. The challenge is how will we do it for shipping? And I think that the final thought is that making radical new technology work often requires creative destruction. You have to take it apart to make it work. There are so many cases of big computer systems. We had one recently in the UK with the National Health System. If you can't get the doctors to put the data into the system, then it isn't going to work. This is a much bigger challenge for the shipping industry than building 300,000-ton tankers. And on that note, I think I'm going to leave you with the challenge, and thank you very much for your attention. And I hope I got it within the 5 minutes.
For the very thought-provoking and fascinating lecture. May I now invite Mr. Andrew Tan, Chief Executive of MPA, to join Dr. Stopford on stage for the panel discussion and Q&A session. We will start off with the panel discussion between Dr. Stopford and Mr. Andrew Tan before inviting questions from the floor.
Well, thank you very much. I think, first of all, let me welcome everyone to this inaugural lecture. It's not the first for the CRC, the Centre for Livable Cities, but it is the first tie-up that we've had between the MPA Academy and the CRC since I've taken over as the Chief Executive of MPA. I think it's part of our approach going forward in terms of bringing new insights and new value to the shipping industry and shipping community itself. And for many of you here who may not traditionally look into this space, we have members of the audience here from a broad spectrum of agencies, industry, But I think, I wouldn't say happy days are here again, but shipping days are here again. I think judging by the large turnout that we see today from the different sectors. But certainly I would like to thank Ting Chai and his team for pulling this together at rather short notice. In fact, this was almost a lecture that never meant to be because of the short notice. But I think Ting Chai is no stranger to this sector himself. As some of you may know, he was the chief executive of the port of Singapore PSA in 96 to 2002. Am I correct? Yes. And since then, he's moved on to URA as a chief executive, and his last post was as the chief executive of the water agency. So we were colleagues when we were working together in the Ministry of Environment and Water Resources itself. But I think for first today, I thank Dr. Stockford for giving a very good overview of the maritime industry. As a historian myself, that's my basic degree, and I found it a very fascinating overview. So when you put an economist and a historian together, you get some product that is in between a history lesson and an economics lesson. But if I may just start the discussion rolling, I wanted to ask you, how do you see the roles of port cities like Singapore, Rotterdam and Shanghai? Here I'm using the word port cities in a very general term itself, but I know you made a point about distinguishing between the two, which is equally important. But how do you see the roles of these cities with ports changing in the course of the next 10, 20, 30 years? Will the rise of Asian port cities in China, India, and to some extent in Southeast Asia resemble those of Europe, North America? And do you envisage port cities becoming more similar in form and function with the globalization of seaborne trade? And do you see shipping itself shaping the ports, or the port shaping shipping?
Well, thank you, Andrew. That's some very interesting questions. The first one about the role of specific ports. You mentioned Rotterdam and what was the other one? And Shanghai. Yeah, I think the key here is to mention the role of cargo. There's a difference between cargo ports which are sitting in a cargo area and ports which are basically entrepot. And I think Shanghai, Rotterdam, both are predominantly cargo ports, and you see that when you visit Rotterdam. They have a different perception of the world. They are very much about the port, and that's where they make their living. But then you have other ports which have a role which is more to do with the shipping services element. Lesser. I think there's many cargo ports, and the cargo ports go from small to large, and they form the framework of trade and always will. The shipping centres, which are both ports and maybe not ports at all, I mean London is not really a port anymore, those are the ones that provide the services to the shipping industry. And I think in that case, we have, for the reasons I mentioned, a changing global framework. And I think the role of the ports providing the services is going to develop perhaps slightly differently, but in a complementary way to the way the cargo ports will develop. And if we do move towards the sort of framework of global trade, which I was arguing makes sense, then I think that we could be looking at one or two super port cities which actually take a leading role. The difference between a port city, the port's responsibility in a cargo state is to its own national cargo requirements. That's what it's there to help. The service ports have a responsibility for actually, to some extent, for providing the shipping industry with the infrastructure it needs to do its job. And I think that's a different executive responsibility and a different focus as well. Not just the ship owners, but the cargo owners, really. So that's my long answer to your short question. The second one Well, the second part of that question was...
in relation to whether shipping will shape the ports, or the ports will shape the shipping. And in particular, I think you mentioned the powerful advent of information technology in terms of knowledge management, and of course that part is going to play a bigger part in the narrative itself. But at the end of the day, you're still shipping, in the case of container liners,
Yes.
boxes.
Yes, I think I think they both have significance. I mean, ports influence shipping, and in the same sense that if you take the hub concept in containers, that was the product of a group of big companies that decided they preferred to run the business that way. That was their strategic decision. And so in that particular case, in some ways, the shipping industry moulded the ports. But in other cases, if the Chinese decide to build a lot of ports to handle cargo, then that will, and the sizes they choose and everything else will influence the shipping industry from that perspective.
And if I were to take this discussion a bit further, and if you were to step in my shoes, and you were looking at Singapore in particular, and having seen the presentation, what are the sort of things that we should be thinking about or worried about, and what are some of the opportunities do you see us taking advantage of?
Well, I think the big issues are, one issue is for Singapore is where the port goes next, and I think that's, you've done an enormous amount of research on that, and I don't want to preempt that, but the container industry, I think, to pick up your previous point, I think in the end, the container industry is your master on that one, and you have to decide where the port goes. Now, where the city goes has a lot of other dimensions which are not really to do with the container industry. They're to do with how Singapore develops. And I think I made, on my sort of, well, hopefully it was an independence analysis, it looks like you're in quite a good space at the moment, because the trade is there, the independence is there, the history is that smaller states do very well in this area because they don't have a cargo commitment which can get in the way. And the challenge really is which is facing the whole cluster of ports today, is whether you can actually find the magic ingredients that enables you to rise up above the pack and become the super city, rather than one of a number of, because I'd say at the moment you have a collection of cities, all of which are important, all of which will continue to play a part. But I think the global shipping industry, in my vision, needs super cities, probably 3, but certainly 2, maybe 3. It needs 1 in each time zone. And the question is, what can you do to build the platform that will bring in the business? And the things I was mentioning were cargo. You need to get the cargo. You don't want the national cargo interest. What you want is for example, when Singapore got the Australian iron ore trade into Singapore, then Clarksons then moved its dry cargo office to Singapore, because that was absolutely worked. And I think the issues, you can just go through the policy issues that are facing ship owners, the finance, the tax, and those are the agenda of things that you know very well.
Well, just very quickly, just pushing the boundaries a bit. I think in Singapore right now, because of the competitive uses for the land itself, questions that are being asked is, how large a port do you need in order to become a maritime centre? In other words, having a cluster of services around your port. And can you be one of these in the league of maybe super city, or one of the key hubs without having a large port?
This is a bit like asking questions about the seas around Taiwan in China. not sure that I'm going to answer this very, very obliquely.
I say this at great risk of running myself out of a job.
I think in the end, you know, I've been through some pretty traumatic businesses in my time, and in the end, realism pays off. I think you have to look at your business very hard and convince yourself about what your customer wants and what you can realistically deliver with what you have. And in the end, you know, that you said, put yourself in, that is your biggest job, is you have to get that realistic perspective. And that will probably lead you to some tough decisions. And, you know, because change always involves tough decisions. But certainly in my experience, tough decisions don't turn out to be very tough in the end, and everybody's glad you did it in the end. So I think one has to move forward on these things. And in terms of the practicalities, I've always been a great believer in direct services. I mean, I've never been a great fan of mega hubs because I think, especially with fuel prices today and time constraints, you can, if you really run the logistics, and I haven't done this, but I suspect that you can get a better deal for many locations by going direct rather than hubbing, but it suited the big companies. This is my theory to hub and spoke. Now that's a hypothesis to test. If you test it and it turns out, then probably you can manage with a smaller port, but maybe you start to form a network and regional networks of direct service ports and things like that, which are again built around my old hobby horse, the information platform. Because the trouble is today people aren't really doing the logistics. They don't do the calculations. The customers aren't aware of how much they could save because it's not in anybody's interest to tell them, you know. So I think there might be a...
You've answered it in a less oblique way than I thought you would, but we'll just pause this here. And,
those were scenarios.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to set aside some time for the audience to ask the burning questions which they have. I've asked my burning questions, and I think we have a good about half an hour or so. I'm quite sure there are many questions that you have to ask. I would suggest that you keep your questions short and maybe to identify yourself, because I know that there are different agencies that are represented in the room today. So who would like to go first? Okay, there's a gentleman here.
Yeah, thank you Hi, I'm Derek Wakelin from K-Line. Very interesting presentation, thank you very much. You differentiated between port cities like Shanghai and Rotterdam and those service cities such as London or Singapore. With the advent of technology, can you see that there won't actually be the need for those service port cities, but if you want a service virtual iCloud city? Because obviously the cost of labour in those service cities are getting more and more expensive, so like your back office functioning might move away and just be a virtual port city.
Well, this is just a personal view. I'm not a great fan of that work at home philosophy. It's the same as you don't need to have centres. I find, certainly, you know, in my immediate direct experience at Clarkson Research, the benefits of being in the same place and the coffee machine, you just need to see people, because often you're dealing with them, you're not quite sure what's important, and within microseconds you find out, you get those little bits of body language which when you put people separately, they get lonely, you know. And so I think, on the contrary, human nature won't change. People like to cluster, ship owners particularly like to cluster, and so do cargo interests. So I hope that doesn't happen, and I am not convinced it will.
Thank you. Another question? Okay, gentleman at the back.
Thank you very much. I come from South Africa, so I'm much more interested about the hype that is there around the world that, you know, Africa is the next big thing. Are the ports there ready for this big economic influx that is envisaged? Thank you.
Yeah, I think we're all watching Africa with enormous interest at the moment. It's been, you know, it was great to see the direct services from West Africa around the Cape to Asia. I mean, that was a big step forward after all those years of running the shuttle services back up to Europe and then through the Suez Canal. So I think that was a sign of the growing critical mass. The big challenge is interesting with the Indian Ocean area. It's becoming more as the trading pattern develops. Now that we've got the fibre optic network up the coast there, and hopefully we're going to see more growth and more structured ports on that coast. I think it's all part of the globalisation part 2, which I was talking about going forward. I think Africa is a very important, massively important part of that. You know?
Thank you. Gentleman on the back.
Thank you. I'm from A-Star. My question is, in a region, normally we have a few mega port, bigger ports in a region as a cargo consolidation or transshipment center. It is not only a port center, but also logistics, trading and financing center. So in this region, recently we noticed that, for example, Shanghai, they are supposed to build a 28 square kilometer free charging zone. They also open their policy in financing and service and so on. So my question is how, I believe that there are other port cities in the region, we also to make some changes. So my question is how Singapore in this kind of situation to maintain its position advantages as an international shipping center in the region, in terms of your view. Thanks.
Thank you. I think if I understood the question rightly, it was to do with the things that Shanghai are doing to promote the movement of trade through Shanghai. And that of course is something for the Shanghai municipal government, which they're very interested in, and is absolutely logical for a cargo port. My argument would be that, you know, what Shanghai is doing there is rather different from what Singapore is doing as a global shipping centre, and the sorts of things that Singapore might focus on would probably be quite different from those things that I assume that would be my assumption about that. So I don't think you should worry too much.
Question? Annie?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Annie Cole from Singapore Management University. I'd actually like one statement, Martin, that you made very early. You said it's always good to look for difficult things. And it's always great. I think that's Singapore's destiny. We should look for the difficult things. So what are the challenges currently in shipping, in port, in sustainability? Because I think if Singapore is to have a purpose and a mission, it would be in trying to link and solve some of the difficult things within our partnership in this room, between trading, between shipping, between logistics, between the A-Stars, the NTU and the SMU. So I loved the last statement you made about information. And I think the A-Star person and the gentleman here that talks about virtual is actually about information. So we are not talking about a virtual port city, but I love the idea of the hub of hubs and the segmentation of ports, looking at a particular industry and how Singapore could be a link to connect the dots together. So what's very difficult right now, and I'd like to think that hopefully Singapore could do the difficult things. Thank you.
Oh, no, well, that's a difficult question. But I'll answer it all the same. Well, I think that, as I said at the beginning, everybody has to choose their own destiny, and all one can give is sort of examples that may or may not be appropriate. It's so easy to give examples that are inappropriate, but I'll give you one or two things I had in mind. It seems to me that ports, and I'm worrying now about having answered your question too frankly, I suppose, following the line of thought, ports are part of logistics. I'm beating the drum for information, and I would argue that probably in some concepts the logistics information system, say for the Asia area, not necessarily global. That's global is too big, but is something that might logically be part. I mean, maybe you get to a point where you don't actually need, and this will upset you as well. You don't need anybody to run your port because a computer's running it. Okay, and incidentally, I saw a video at the weekend on YouTube of Californians had built this robot dog, which was absolutely unbelievable. It was a great big dog. And they'd actually put panniers on it, and then they put this dog with long legs to walk on ice. And the video was of this dog walking on ice, and it was unbelievable. You know, it was sort of fell over, recovered itself, and I think we just don't really appreciate the strength and depth of the technology that is now just out there, not on the horizon, but available. And so I think, you're trying to push forward into difficult things, and I think getting really good logistics, I mean, everyone talks logistics, but I think logistics is one area. I think in another area, not necessarily Singapore, but one of the things that I've noticed, we have 1.25 million people on board ship at the moment. There is no global database of any sort, and nobody, the IMO, for good reasons for IMO, doesn't want to touch it. The people are a bit iffy, they won't give the information, but surely the global shipping market I'm talking about should have a people database where you can actually look up whether the master's ticket is actually a genuine one. And so I think those, but of course these things are very hard to do, A, because they involve databases, B, they involve getting people to cooperate with you, and that is hard. And C, they get them, someone has to believe that they have the mandate to do it. So
I think, Annie, to your question, I think there are some driving forces right now that are also forcing us to look at how we can better optimize the productivity of our port. So we're looking at how to optimize the land usage, how to optimize the labor productivity, because the same factors that are affecting the rest of the economy, the manpower crunch, the shortage of land, these are the same sort of drivers that are forcing us to relook at some of these operations itself. But having said that, before coming to this lecture, I visited the PSA Port Institute, and they were showing me the training they were doing for some of the lashing workers. And so at the end of the day, some of this work is quite manual. It's quite difficult to replace it unless you get a very sophisticated machine that can secure your boxes. And I'm not saying it's impossible, but I think it requires new ways of doing things and maybe some redesign. I'm not sure when the last time the container box that's so ubiquitous today was redesigned, but it's not just one box that you have to redesign. You have to get it adopted as a global standard because of the global nature of the industry itself. But I think these are things that really get us to look at how we can optimize our productivity.
Yes. And I think that again comes back to the need the industry has for some framework. And it probably, in that sense, it is a framework. It needs, if you threw back the question, it says, if you're going to do something like that, in what, how do you, in what institutions actually would lead it, you can, and fund it.
Can we move on to another question? People who are not from the shipping community, feel free to ask questions. I know we have some architects here, we have some urban planners, we have the technologists. I think we have in this room the realm of experts that could, Sharon, I see your hand.
Thank you. Sharon Siddiqui from the LKY CIC Center for Innovative Cities. I just wanted to push you a bit further on this comment that you made, separating or preferring to separate ports and cities rather than talking about port city. Yeah? And I was wondering whether if you can envision in future being comfortable with that term in a future city which is a subset perhaps of a global city.
Future city, which is a, don't pass. Could you? What do you think? What do you mean by a future city, which is a subset of the city?
Well, I'm thinking that the term port city has sort of gone out of fashion, and nobody really uses it in the contemporary sense any longer. So, under what circumstances do you think that it might be possible for you to be comfortable labeling a city a port city?
Okay, I mean, I think my comment probably did come from just the perception that ports and the sort of shipping services centres I was thinking of are essentially different business units. One is a fairly, I mean, ports in the end is a physical business. You just described it. You've got to whack containers, you've got to bring the ships in. It's actually what Peter Drucker would call a moving things business. It's like manufacturing. It's a process. Whereas shipping services is touchy-feely, getting the right people there, totally different animal, and on the whole, and much more difficult to do in many ways. And therefore, you may say, well, perhaps you need to find ways of not burdening the port with the sort of problems that the port city has in getting things moved forward, and equally not burdening the port city with the city with the port issues. That doesn't mean they're not the same organisation. It just means that you recognise that they're fundamentally different businesses and maybe have different visions.
I suppose as a follow-up to Sharon's question is, I mean, you've done previous work on the region and regional history. You're familiar with that. And the question is for Singapore, which has such a great maritime history, and over time we've developed other parts of our economy, and the port has strong now. It started growing again, and I suppose the question that's going around, I suppose right now, is whether we see ourselves as a city in a port or a port in a city, in the same way in which we are debating over some of these aspects in relation to where we find our new drivers of economic growth itself. I must confess, I've not thought about this very deeply myself, but I was just triggered off by her comment about going forward. Is there some way to recapture or even strengthen some of that maritime linkages that we've had in the past without being too sentimental about it? Yeah.
Well, I mean, obviously the port is a discrete entity. The shipping community here is a discrete entity, and then you have the rest of the community, or the rest of the city, which is doing other things. I think that the historical lesson, which I think is quite a good one, is that on the whole, shipping is a bit of it's a delicate flower, and it does need, it flourishes best under regimes which value it and which appreciate its peculiarities. And I think that and then it can be a very rewarding thing to have. So I suppose that the issue is ensuring that, well, it's just establishing just how committed, how great the commitment is to the whole maritime activity here, because it's a big chunk of the economy. And the position on my west line, your geographical position is pretty good. You've got an asset there. And shipping, you saw the growth curve. And ports have been high return, but shipping services are also very high. It's good business. And there's not many, the other question is who else does it and who are your competitors? And going back to the difficult questions thing, who is actually willing to actually really go to the next level?
Another question from the gentleman in front.
Sorry, can you hear me? Yeah, Dr. Stockman, you mentioned in your last line, 3 super cities, 3 different signposts. Can you elaborate a little bit where and how do you define that? Eventually, who will be the winner?
Oh, okay. Well,
you can ask that question, I can't.
There's no winners, only losers, as they say. The logic behind that, the reason I came up with the 3 super cities idea was I felt that you needed a significant, that for the next level, and we are talking global visions here, and I felt if you're going to have that global vision, you actually need the industry which is going offshore in many ways, which is many small companies. It needs some sort of committed resource, more than we've got at the moment, at a global level, to provide the support it'll need. So that there should be a framework for 1 or 2 places to emerge as the spider in the web, if you see what I mean. The reason it was 3 was that I felt 2 was not enough. And there are 2, the very obvious one is the time zone thing. I mean, you can do virtual stuff till you're blue in the face, but you still, half the world's asleep when the other half's awake. And so you do need, it is good to have, so I thought, well, you're bound to have 2 in different time zones, and you can guess who the candidates are for that. And the third one, I think, is the one that's going to come out from left field, and we don't quite know who that is. But in disruptive technology, if I'm right about that, then somebody else. It might be, it might be some Geneva or some landlocked city. Who can tell? It's just somebody who actually grabs, who maybe somebody will grab the IT and do what you were suggesting and set up. The virtual bit. You'll still have the physical ones, but you end up with a third which sort of does the IT platform, if you see what I mean. And that they can be anywhere, as you say.
We have time for some more questions. Any other questions? Oh, 2 persons. Okay, we'll take both questions.
Yeah, I'm Francis from Express Leaders. I guess this is a question for both Andrew and Martin. In the context of Singapore, right? I'm just playing it 50, 100 years down the road, right? If I'm just wondering about Singapore's limits in shipping in the port context, right? When Singapore hits 200 million TEUs throughput, for example, right? What's next for Singapore, right? And what's next for MPA besides maintaining Singapore? Does MPA have a role beyond Singapore? And which relates to our earlier discussions on the future.
It's difficult because you know the answer but can't talk about it, and I don't know the answer. So these are always difficult questions, it's a bit like the question that nobody, thank God, has asked what the freight market's going to do next year. Please don't ask that one.
You now know why it's so difficult for public agencies nowadays, and the public is thinking 50, 100 years, far longer than your own time frames.
Yeah, well, you know, 10 years doesn't go far, does it?
Right.
It's,
Yeah.
It takes 10 years to think about things.
No, but I would say that the only reason why Singapore is here where it is today, I mean, we are celebrating our 50th anniversary next 2015, right? Right? So I think it's 50 years, depending on where you see the cup is half full or half empty, but I think in my view it's still a relatively short history. And the only way in which we have kept ourselves relevant is to keep adapting to the change around us. I mean, we are too small to shape the course of global events, and I think even in the case of shipping itself being such a global industry, we really have to adapt ourselves to changes in the industry. So right now, as Martin has highlighted, sea trade, which currently takes up 80% of all global trade, is going to increase. You've heard that the center of gravity is shifting to the Pacific. I would say that we are growing our port, but you're right in saying that even despite growing the port, there will come a stage where we'll run up against the needs of housing, transportation, other industry development. So I don't think we can keep on growing forever, but I think to the extent that if we look at port itself in its broader sense, not just a global port, but also international maritime center, which is why the mission of the NPA is not just to develop ourselves as a premier global hub port, but also as an international maritime center. So it's a two-pronged approach. I tried to get an answer from Martin whether the port could be a small component and the International Maritime Center could perhaps one day, like London, become a bigger component than the port itself, perhaps. Can we do it? Why not? Should we try? I would say yes.
I mean, just to follow up on that, if you take 50 years, then the key issue is building depth of capability in the right areas, and that's, you know, that is a road you have to start down, and it's a long, slow road.
Now,
Yeah.
there was a gentleman who had a question as well.
Yeah, but Stafford, when you showed the trends, you mentioned the price for fossil fuels being predicted as $30 by now, or actually in the future still, and now being 200, just because people take trends from the past and extrapolate them. You did as well with the freight increase. Don't you think that things like changes in production, less mass production, more 3D printing, and sustainability, less raw materials available, that the whole shipping might still double, I don't doubt that, but might peter out at some point, max out?
Well, these are the sort of granular issues of trade forecasting, and they're all absolutely things that you can look at and apply judgment in detail. My forecast was half the growth rate, or my projection, if you like, was half the growth rate of the previous growth rate. So I'd factors some of this in. I mean, the other side of the coin, the side I didn't show you, is that the big importers today, the OECD countries, which are 1.3 billion people, import 5 to 7 tons per capita. The other 6.5 billion people in the world import a ton per capita. So even 3D printing, you can't. There are limitations. But I do think that there's an awful lot of things like pre-refining and so forth, and there's a lot of multiple movements which you could use to slow things down. And of course, as an economist, we may get a bit unlucky. It may not be such a good free trade world in the next 50 years as it has been in the last one. I mean, it's been a wonderful 50 years, you know, and perhaps we were a little bit more unstable now. But all your points are valid, and they just make his job much more difficult, you know.
Any other questions? Do you have time for one more question? If not, I will exercise my prerogative, okay? Just forgive me, because I know that there are some students in our midst here. And it just struck me that the people in this industry, in the shipping industry, are intensely passionate. This is what I discovered in my 2 months, well, not even 2 months of being in this position. And I'm just trying to figure out why that is so, particularly during this period when, you know, we're in a downturn, maybe it's like you're recovering, you see the light at the end of the tunnel, but it goes through cycles, right? But nonetheless, everyone I meet is still very passionate about the industry itself. So here's a question that's more philosophical rather than related to anything that we've talked about earlier on. How do you, and you yourself, you're very passionate on this subject, your book, Maritime Economics, is already in its third run. I would suggest that those of you who have not read it should take a stab at it. But this has given you a good overview, so those of you who attended this lecture, well, and good for you, you can do a synopsis of that. But how do you maintain that passion for this subject? And how can we fire the enthusiasm of the young to join the maritime sector?
I think you're doing it. I mean, this is it's these sort of gatherings that are so rewarding. It's people. Shipping is one of the real global communities. It shares so many cultural things. It has the, you know, even the cycles. It's pain and pleasure and pain, and everybody's suffering together. And I think the
that's one way to look at it.
I don't know another industry. I mean, I've been in it 42 years, and I wouldn't say I've enjoyed every minute of it, but I wouldn't contemplate another industry, and I haven't seen another industry that's such fun. It's a great business, and not only that, it's doing a really good job. I mean, you know, you saw those curves. We're shipping stuff for the same price now as in 1947 or not 18. I mean, what other industry can say that? You know, there's no fuss in this business. It's a good business, and I think that's why. And you can make $1 billion if you take a few risks. So that's good. I'm sure someone out here will make $1 billion.
Wow. Very good. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Stoffert. I think it's been an excellent lecture. Let's put our hands together. Give him a round.
Stoffert and Mr. Andrew Tan for sharing your insights and experiences with us. We would now like to invite Mr. Khoo, Executive Director of CLC, to present tokens of appreciation to Dr. Stoffert and to Mr. Tan. Mr. Khoo, please. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our lecture. We thank you for your participation and do join us as we feature 4 more international renowned experts who will be in Singapore in the months of February and March. Do stay tuned to CLC Millers and website for more details. We will also be seeking your feedback via email and would really appreciate if you could take a minute to help us improve the lecture series. Have a good evening and we hope to see you again. Thank you.